Hello, welcome to Your Questions, Our Answers. I'm Matthew Bakovic, a technical director here in the CERT division of the Software Engineering Institute. This afternoon, I'm joined by two of my colleagues, and we'll explore insider threat. As this is Insider Threat Month, we encourage you to submit questions and make this an interactive session. I'm joined by Dan Costa. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Matt. Good afternoon. I'm Dan Costa. I'm the Deputy Technical Director of the CERT National Insider Threat Center here at the Carnegie Mellon Software Engineering Institute. I lead our team's research and engineering efforts into identifying how insider incidents tend to evolve over time, what differentiates a couple of different insider attack types from one another, and what organizations can do to best prevent, detect, and respond to those activities happening within their own organizations. We are also joined remotely by Randy Trzak. Hello, Randy.
Hi, Dan. Hi, Matt. Thanks very much for joining me in. Again, I'm Randy Trzak. I'm the director of the National Insider Threat Center in the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon. I'm actually at the second annual National CISA Cybersecurity Summit in National Harbor, Maryland. So it's a pleasure to be here. Like Dan, I've been involved in the insider threat research domain for a number of years, going back to 2006. And as Dan said, what we're trying to do from a research perspective, being a federal lab, is to do research into the challenge problem around insider threat mitigation. And throughout this particular webinar, we certainly want to make you aware of the research we've done, but also research that's been done across the community as well. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I'd like to start with a foundational question, Dan and Randy, which is, how does the SEI define insider threats? And how does this definition relate or perhaps differ from other definitions of insider threat?
Sure. Thanks, Matt. What we take a look at when we think about the definitions for insider threats, there are so many across government, across industry, across academia. What we tried to do was come up with what were those common threads and common components and put together a pretty generalizable definition for insider threat. So our definition of insider threat really focuses on the potential for an individual who has or had authorized access to an organization's critical assets to misuse that access, either with malicious intent or unintentionally, to act in a way that could negatively impact the organization. So what you got there is the framework to build a more specific and focused insider threat definition based on your individual organization's size, scope, governance structure, regulatory requirements, and what your organization's critical assets are. So I'd like to turn it over to Randy to talk a little bit more about kind of how the scope of the insider threat problem can vary and what the breadth of it is across different types of asset classes, different types of industries, and different types of threat actors.
Thanks, Dan. And that was a great introduction into the definition of insider threats. And really what we want to try to do is tie this back to a risk-based model to organizations, identifying organizations' critical assets. So if we start with who are the individuals that are granted authorized access into your critical assets, which could be your information or your technologies or your facilities, and more broadly, the people granting authorized access, we can start defining the individuals to be your current or former employees. And based upon the research we've done, we still include former employers as a potential threat to organizations' critical assets, as we've seen a number of individuals cause harm after the organization believed or thought they disabled the authorized access. To expand that definition a little bit broader to include the other folks that are granted authorized access, to include full-time employees or part-time employees, your contractors, your subcontractors, your trusted business partners. So if we start with who has authorized access to your organization's critical assets, then we can start narrowing down the true threat to your organization's critical assets, recognizing that not everybody is a threat to everything in the organization. And then as we start moving across the diagram here, start looking at, as Dan said, someone with malicious intent who intentionally could cause harm, or someone who unintentionally may cause harm, looking at the impact to the organization. Someone who may, with malicious intent, want to defraud the organization, or someone who, with malicious intent, may want to steal the intellectual property of the organization or commit IT system sabotage. Or if you're in a government space, maybe national security espionage. and really trying to, again, protect the critical assets to be the information assets, but also the people assets. Start looking for threats to include workplace violence or other types of harm to the facilities in your organization as well. And then specifically from a prevention standpoint, how can we prevent the impact to organizations? Someone who may want to try to cause harm specifically to the financial viability of an organization or the availability of the assets as well. So really, we try to lay this out as a way to narrow the scope of the threat to the organization's critical assets. And we found this is where organizations should start with an asset-based approach to the threats. Those threats can be external or internal. They can be malicious or non-malicious, human or non-human. So insider threat is just one component of that risk-based equation.
Thank you, Randy. I have a follow-on question regarding the nature of the insider threat. You mentioned the organization's critical assets, understanding those assets and understanding the folks that have access to those assets. So over time, the nature of assets has changed. I'm thinking about the rise of digital assets and information systems within organizations. People are still people. There are malicious actors and there are those that do things in an unintended way that result in some negative experience. Could Dan or Randy, could you please describe how we've seen the definition of critical asset and the insider threat actor evolve over time?
I'll start. I think, Matt, you talked about technology assets, and certainly we've seen an increase in the variety of the different types of technology information assets that are critical to an organization's mission success, right? Not only the types of devices and the types of information that are being generated by a variety of different applications that are now increasingly digital, but we're also talking about how easy it is now for our individual employees to obtain access to that information. Thinking about disruptive technologies in the past few years and decades, like mobile devices, which have made it increasingly easier for individuals to access an organization's critical assets. Well, with ease of use, also from a security perspective, comes the potential for ease of misuse. And we've really seen organizations kind of struggle to keep up with maintaining control and understanding of where their critical information assets are and across what platforms, devices, and technologies they can go to find that information.
Randy, other thoughts about that?
Yeah, certainly. As we described and as Dan presented the definition of insiders, someone that's granted authorized access, again, to the assets themselves, but also keep in mind that these individuals may have knowledge of what preventative or detective controls that are in place within the organizations. And as we started to decompose some of the incidents over time, we have the empirical database of over 2,500 incidents. When specifically fraud occurs, an individual has knowledge of what the fraud detection capabilities are, and in many cases was able to bypass the detection because of that knowledge specifically of what the organization was looking for. And looking specifically at theft of intellectual property, again, the digital asset being the intellectual property or the confidential or sensitive information, knowledge of what the organization is doing to detect ways by which information may be leaving the organization could allow an individual to bypass those assets, the detection of those asset controls. So really the insider threat has evolved over time as individuals with malicious intent, with the motive, with the incentive to cause harm, they are able to use that knowledge and the authorized access to bypass some of those preventative or detective controls over time. So again, the main motivation may not have changed over time, but the way by which an individual creates fraud or steals the intellectual property or commits sabotage or commits some type of espionage activity, that may change based upon the technology that is available.
I'd like to expand our exploration of the nature of the insider. And what I mean there is you talked about motivation. So in the research that we've conducted, have we seen any sort of change over time regarding the things that motivate people to act as insiders? Or is it sort of a consistent baseline between those that are malicious and those that are unintentionally doing something that causes harm to the organization?
Matt, I think where we see variance in terms of motivation for different types of insider attacks is in the actual threat scenario itself, meaning individuals that go on to commit acts of fraud are typically motivated by financial gain, whereas individuals that commit acts of IT system sabotage are typically motivated by revenge against the organization and some perceived misjustice or some unmet expectation. And we can add to that our discussion of theft of intellectual property, which we typically see insiders motivated to commit for the desire to start a competing business or to benefit themselves in another business sense. So I think over time, what we've seen have been a variance in motivations by attack type. Now, I do think as we've seen organizations kind of expand the scope of their insider threat programs, we're starting to get more nuances into kind of that root cause analysis. And another emerging kind of motivation that we're seeing has to do with kind of individual feelings on the freedom of the availability of information. We are seeing an increase in cases of theft of intellectual property, insiders who are motivated by an ideology to share some information that is kind of closely held within the organization because they have a difference of opinion in terms of what should or should not be shared with kind of a broader population than what policy is dictated that information is authorized to be shared with.
Thanks, Dan. So Randy, a question for you. Is there a specific type of threat actor or attack type that's particularly difficult to both detect and mitigate?
Well, certainly insider, by the definition, insider threats are hard to detect, as organizations in many cases will try to pre-screen employees on the way in. That we go through the hiring process to determine the trustworthiness of individuals coming into an organization. And then over time, once they get acclimated into the organization, most organizations will continue to trust their employees. And over time, unless they are doing the detection capabilities, unless they're doing the prevention capabilities, they may tend to over-trust individuals to where, again, you know somebody, you see something on a day-to-day basis, you see someone on a day-to-day basis, we tend to just trust that they're doing what's in the best interest of the organization. So throughout the research, we've tried to highlight the need to trust but verify. Just like the primary motivation of security is trust but verify, insider threats by their nature are pretty difficult to be able to determine once you kind of overcome the trust and the ability to verify the online activity. But when we look specifically at the categories that Dan described, an individual defrauding the organization tends to be categorized as someone with authorized access to the applications, to the data, someone that's in a data management process where they actually will bypass some of the controls because of their knowledge of what's being detectable or detected by the organization. And really theft of intellectual property. Think about all the ways by which the intellectual property is moving around the organization and outside the organization. Again, we're trying to put controls in place that can prevent the data from leaving through email, through the file transfer protocols, through USB usage and other mechanisms as well. So again, the ability for us to try to prevent all of the mechanisms, the avenues by which data can be exfiltrated, is difficult for organizations, again, given the trust placed upon the insiders as well. And then from an IT system sabotage, think about who's more likely or has the access to commit sabotage. That tends to be the system administrator, someone with authorized access. And in some cases, the system administrators are the ones responsible for preventing or detecting the interruption of that IT service as well. So really, as we get to the end of the presentation, we'll kind of tie back to some of the best practices, putting defense in depth within the IT operations, putting dual controls or separation of duties in the IT operations may be helpful to mitigate or reduce the risk that an insider could be able to sabotage a system or service. And then really when we kind of expand outside of the accidental, again, here's where we have done a lot of work recently in the non-malicious, the accidental, someone who accidentally discloses information or someone who accidentally loses an IT controlled asset by the organization, which exposes information. So if we kind of categorize as the malicious, non-malicious, the accidental is a bit difficult as well, as there's no malicious intent. But again, that is a bit hard to be able to prevent someone from causing harm when they accidentally click on that email with the attachment, which opens up something through the phishing email that comes in. So generally, there are some patterns. There are individuals who are more likely. But again, as we look at the malicious, non-malicious, the accidental is a little bit harder to be able to prevent and detect because there is no malicious intent.
Thanks, Randy. Dan, other thoughts about that? So if I could just ask a more specific question regarding that. So Randy's laid out for us the typical threat actors and the attack types. We've now parsed those things that are intentional, those things that are accidental. Within that universe of things an organization must consider, is there a specific concentration of either risk or a pronounced lack of capability in identifying and mitigating any one of those, or maybe multiple categories of those threat actors or attack types?
Sure. I think where organizations struggle from a detection perspective is being able to differentiate the malicious activity or even the unintentional activity that will result in some loss event from everything else that is benign. So if you think about kind of in a general level, what is hardest for insider threat programs to detect is the behaviors and activity that look as close to normal as they possibly can for as long as they possibly can before that loss event, before that negative impact or affect to the organization occurs. So individuals with robust knowledge and understanding and even maybe operational responsibilities in terms of executing a security practice within an organization are going to know the best ways to kind of avoid detection, stay under the radar, stay within the bounds of their normal behaviors and activity to delay detection as long as possible. And we've also seen more sophisticated threat actors go a long way in terms of trying to make it harder to identify who the actual account or individual is associated with the threat activity.
Thanks, Dan. So just a reminder for folks that are watching this on YouTube, we certainly welcome your questions, and the questions come in for us. How do you advise companies to name their projects and teams, that is insider threat project and teams? I sometimes hear that folks are shying away from naming it insider threat. So Dan and Randy, thoughts about any potential sensitivity around a description of the insider threat? Now, certainly, we're not suggesting that calling it something different and changes what it is. Intrinsically, we understand what the problem is, but thoughts about maybe the palatability or the appetite organizations have for calling this an insider threat program or detection effort?
I'd be happy to take that one. Great question. Thanks very much for asking that question. So let's kind of break this down into the name of the program itself. And there's certainly the negative connotation of insider threat programs in many organizations. Because again, insider threat, it tends to at least be perceived as distrusting the employees, trying to catch the employees doing something. Now, if we break this down into the federal government, so the federal government back in 2011, 2012, the White House released an executive order. That executive order 13587 specifically called for the development of an insider threat program to be called the insider threat program within that government organization. The NISPOM conforming change 2 specifically, again, provides the requirements to say you must have an insider threat program. Now, where we see the differences, and we recognize, again, the negative connotation potentially, particularly is in academia or in industry as well. We've worked with organizations that are using different names, whether they call it insider risk management or whether they're calling it as part of the general security program of the organization. They have a component that is insider risk management, or they're calling it some type of general risk management program as well. There is some sensitivity to that. Now, one of the publications we do want to call your attention to is the unanticipated consequences of building insider threat programs, which is a publication available on the CERT and the Software Engineering Institute website, which described exactly that. What are some of the common characteristics of the programs? What are the intended consequences, but also what are the unintended consequences as well? So one of the early stages of building that actual program itself should be getting the stakeholders involved to be able to decide what is the actual name of the program, which then will imply the scope of the program to say what's in scope, but also what's out of scope of the program as well. So there's a number of suggestions in that particular publication of what might be descriptive of the program to not avoid the idea that you are addressing insider threats, but actually naming it to be consistent with the security culture you're trying to build within your organization.
So Randy, you've given us a substantive suggestion regarding naming the program. I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight the things that we can offer organizations at no cost. So Dan, could you walk us through the artifacts that we can offer folks that are attacking or trying to build a program around the insider threat problem? So I'm thinking of the entire sort of body of work we've done at the SCI and those things that are readily available to the folks that might be viewing today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Matt. I think the first place to start is going to be the Common Sense Guide to Mitigating Insider Threats. We're on the 6th edition of this guide, and what this is a highlight of the best practices that our research has suggested are most effective at insider threat prevention, detection, and response. In the 6th edition of the Common Sense Guide, we've added our 21st best practice, which has to do with counterbalancing positive incentives in with the traditional security measures as a way to increase a couple of different factors of employee engagement, connectedness at work, and perceived organizational support. So the Common Sense Guide is a wonderful foundation for folks that are looking for the most consolidated recommendations for end-to-end insider risk mitigation from us within an organization. Also on our website, we have over 125 publications that'll provide things like statistics from our insider threat incident corpus that show the patterns and trends of specific incident types in specific industry sectors and how we've seen that over time. We also have a lot of different deep dives into some of the technical aspects of developing and maintaining the architecture, the data, and the analytics techniques that enterprises use to collect and analyze data to make measures of insider risk at scale.
Thank you, Dan. So a related question. When you attend conferences, I'm thinking about walking through the vendor expo at any large information security conference. I'm sort of bewildered by the array of blinking lights and seemingly same-sounding names of things that are offered to me as technical solutions to solve problems. The insider threat space is no different. I believe that a problem like insider threat can't be solved only with technology, but rather process is a core component of addressing this issue. Randy, could you please describe sort of the optimal mix? Certainly technology is part of the solution set for this problem, but I'm sort of leading you to an answer, and I don't mean to do that, but I'd like you to explain how process and technology fit together in addressing insider threat.
Absolutely, that's a great question, and the way you started the question is absolutely true. We use some, off of the napkin, off of the cuff metrics around about 100 plus solutions that are trying to address the insider threat problem within organizations. Those solutions in many cases are tools or technologies or some type of support provided from a vendor in that particular area. Now, from that perspective, recognizing that a tool is a piece of the program, it is very valuable to do things such as anomaly detection. Those anomalies are very good once you have a normal or perceived baseline normal set of activity, whether that be for an individual or a group or an organization, then we can start doing some type of anomaly detection. So tools are absolutely part of the program, but don't rely upon the tool to be your program. As you look to build a formal insider risk program or an insider threat program, as you said, Matt, it's absolutely imperative that we start early on to get the stakeholders involved to define the requirements of the program. As we look to initiate the program, it'll be very critical that we incorporate that into your enterprise-wide risk assessment processes that you currently have in place. The process, again, as we start with asset identification, it's critical that we start there to identify what's most important to us as an organization, what or who are the threats that could potentially compromise those critical assets, what are the business processes that need to be in place or the critical services that need to be in place that will allow us to achieve the mission of the organization. So in addition to asset protection, it's critical service protection, business process protection, and we need to put a governance structure in place over top of the program to make sure that we are truly doing asset protection from all threats. And at the same time, when we're trying to address insider threats, that we are protecting the privacy and civil liberties of the organization's employees as well. And then when we start working with the contracting base, the trusted business partner base, when we start expanding to cloud service providers or the supply chain of organizations as well, there are potentially insider threats in that as well. So it very, very much starts early on with definition of what the program is, what the assets are, and not to overlook the business processes, the critical services as critical assets that should be protected within an organization as well. And then when we build the formal program, making sure, again, we have the practices, the policies, the procedures in place that will actually provide a governance structure over top of and governance of the insider threat team that's in the organization as well. So that's a great question. Again, insider threat tools are an important part of the program, but don't rely upon that as the soul of your program or the entirety of your program as well.
Matt, if I may, insider threat tools are really no different from any other software solution we use within an enterprise, where it can help us automate some portion of a process. They are not themselves the process. So a lot of times we see insider threat programs make an early common mistake of trying to build a program around a tool or the current capabilities of the tools that they have. And we always caution those folks to be able to articulate what it is that they're trying to detect, what it is that they're trying to stop from occurring within their networks and systems, what they're trying to deter their workforce from doing, how they can act in the interests of the organization, and use that as the foundation for the requirements they'll need to make sure they have the right technology to support those business decisions and the processes they'll be using to support those business decisions. The insider threat programs themselves don't typically tend to make a lot of the final says in terms of the mitigation and response options when it comes to insider threats. Those are typically stakeholder organization or parts of the organization like human resources when it comes to making decisions around someone's long-term employment eligibility with the organization or the need to change roles either internal to the organization or internal to a team, or things like information technology or information security where we're talking about someone's continued access to a particular asset. Right? So the insider threat program really is about using tools and their access to data from different parts of the organization to help those decision makers make better decisions faster than they could have without the timeliness and the breadth of the information that the insider threat program and its associated tooling can provide.
Thanks, Dan. So a number of questions have come in from our viewers. A question about measuring success. So how does one, or how does an organization measure the effectiveness or the efficacy of an insider threat program? And related, how does an organization measure the return on investment? So let me preface that by saying we understand that the absence of negative events is not a valid measure in the long term in information security. So Dan, Randy, what are your thoughts about how you measure the effectiveness and the return on investment of an insider threat program?
Randy,
that's a great question. Please go, Dan. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I think, Matt, measuring the effectiveness of the insider threat program is one of the biggest challenges that we're seeing organizations still face today. And a lot of it has to do with, again, the scope of the insider threat and the variance in the looks and feels of insider threat programs from organization to organization. So a lot of the times when folks are looking for what those measures of effectiveness for their programs are, those really depend on what the scope and function and mission of the insider threat program is, what the critical assets we're trying to protect are in the scope of the program, from what types of threat scenarios. And that's, I think, that barrier to entry for a lot of folks when they're trying to figure out how to measure the effectiveness of the program is knowing specifically what it is that they're trying to measure. I'll turn it over to Randy. I'm sure you have lots of good things to say about kind of the specific ways that we can measure those various aspects. But I wanted to at least set the stage that this is a problem that we really see organizations struggle with. And again, a lot of the ROI, those challenges are going to be pretty consistent with things like cybersecurity and lots of other functions within businesses. But just wanted to set the stage for insider threat programs.
Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Again, that's a great stage setting lead into. Again, think about what you're measuring cybersecurity effectiveness today. Think about the general metric around how many incidents did you prevent? How many incidents did you detect? When you detected it, how quickly did you respond? Those same types of metrics can be used for insider incident prevention and detection as well. And when we start doing things such as recovery from an insider incident, same basic metrics we can tie back to security as well, from the time that an incident occurred till we detect it as well. So I would say start by taking the security metrics you're currently using today, applying an insider threat incident prevention, detection, and response to that, and we can start using those as some of the basic metrics as well. And certainly we've seen organizations be very specific to where, for example, if we detect a departing employee trying to take some data with them as they're walking out the door, some organizations have used that they prevented the incident, but also the value of the asset that was prevented from leaving could be one of the metrics as well. So again, trying to tie it back to a cost savings or a cost avoidance is a good way from a prevention standpoint to be able to, again, tie that back into the return on investment as well. And the return on investment of an insider threat program, the same types of challenge you'll have with information technology as a whole or information security as a whole are the same challenges with this as well. So as in most organizations, information technology is not a cost generating revenue stream in organizations. It's usually a cost outlay to organizations. So the best you can to tie it back into the financial impact to the organization's bottom line is where you want to try to tie into the specific metrics of an insider threat program.
Thank you.
For organizations that are adopting kind of quantifiable risk metrics, right? We can talk about a quantifiable reduction in risk through the investment of certain security controls. Another really interesting challenge area for insider threat programs has to do with some of those kind of knock-on benefits of an insider threat program. If we talked about the stakeholder parts of the organization that are going to be taking the information from the insider threat program and using that to make better business decisions, we can talk about kind of a reduction in the amount of time that it takes from that concerning behavior or activity to make some final decision or disposition on what to do with that information. You can also start to think about things like, has the insider threat program, through some initiative or through some additional data they've been able to collect or generate, been able to improve a process within another part of the organization, such as making enhancements to the organization's asset management policy or the data classification policy. A lot of the times when we see organizations get insider threat programs up and running, we see these kind of extra benefits to the other stakeholder parts of the organization the insider threat program relies on, either as data providers or as folks who will be consumers of the insights that they're providing. And those additional process improvements can be other really effective strategies, shy of being quantifiable from a quantifiable reduction in risk perspective, that can help insider threat program managers kind of share the good news of the insider threat program as being kind of a force multiplier up the org chart into the executive leadership team and potentially into the boards of directors.
Thanks. I'd like to.
And Matt and Dan, if I could just real quick, just add one more point to that. Thanks, Dan. I apologize, Matt. Also, just want to call out the great work that's being done by the National Insider Threat Task Force, the NITF. A great body of work is being done within the federal government around insider threat mitigation. That particular question kind of reminded me of an interview that was done with the director, Wayne Belk, of the National Insider Threat Task Force, talked about the progress of insider threat program building within the federal government and talked about the successes, but also what they found as the unanticipated consequences of actually the prevention of things like suicide of people within the federal government as well. So while that may not be a financial measurement, that unanticipated consequence of the program was providing the benefit of the management of people in the organization and the defining of the processes and the people management are certainly the side effects of an effective insider threat program as well. So it was great to kind of call that and see Wayne Belk talk about that through the National Insider Threat Task Force.
And before we leave the idea of measures of effectiveness, and I had already mentioned that this is kind of an ongoing area of research, I'm currently participating in an Intelligence and National Security Alliance subcommittee that's working on developing a guide for measures of effectiveness for insider threat programs. So we're targeting an early 2020 release for that, and we've recently wrapped up a survey where we've asked insider threat programs kind of what metrics they're currently using to help them measure the effectiveness of their insider threat program.
Thanks, Dan. So I'd like to stay on the topic of quantification or measurement. And this is the question I pose to both you, Dan, and you, Randy, which is, to detect insiders, you need to know you have to have a baseline and then their attributes or indicators of activity. Is there a list of indicators that's prioritized or otherwise expresses indicators from weak to strong or strong to weak that the folks watching today could use in constructing an insider threat program?
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. I think the best resource to go to for that is the CERT Guide to Insider Threats. It's a book that Randy, Don Capelli, and Andrew Moore put out a few years back that kind of laid out our foundational body of knowledge in terms of what comprises fraud, theft of intellectual property, and IT system sabotage. And how we built the models of those three different incident types was through the collection and analysis of hundreds then at the time of incidents in each of those kind of particular threat categories. So what we tried to do was build out what are those concerning behaviors and activity that were most commonly occurring in each of those different threat types. And we can use that frequency of occurrence in kind of existing case data as a way to kind of form the foundation for a prioritization strategy we're trying to use for those potential risk indicators.
Thanks, and I think it's another good example of where there are answers, or at least guidance, readily available right now, available from the CERT website, where you can sort of tap into our collective knowledge about insider threat. I have a more basic question here, but I think a really interesting one from one of the folks that's watching the live stream. Is there a difference between data exfiltration and data loss? And if so, how would you describe that difference?
So great question. So if you think about data exfiltration, typically the exfiltration tends to imply some type of intent on the part of the individual. The exfiltration, again, in many cases, malicious motivated. There's some reason by which an individual is trying to take the data out of an organization. As Dan described when we talked about theft of intellectual property, primary motivations are to take the organization's information to a competing organization or to start a competing organization. In about 25% of the cases that we've analyzed, an individual tended to take the intellectual property to benefit a foreign government or foreign organization. So when we describe data exfiltration, it tends to imply some type of malicious intent. When we talk about data loss, again, data loss, there could be some type of unintentional threat to the organization where an individual didn't mean to take it. They tended to expose the data. One of the publications we would call your attention to is the publications around the unintentional insider threat, where we describe 4 broad categories of the unintentional insider threat, where someone accidentally discloses information, or when someone is actually the victim of some type of malicious software, usually through some type of phishing activity, or where an individual improperly handles physical documents that contains the information the organization is entrusted to protect, or someone is actually losing control of the digital or the devices that are provisioned by an organization as well. So we talk about exfiltration, that tends to be where we tend to see the exfiltration, that there may be some motivations, there may be some behavioral characteristics that could be detected by the organizations. When we talk about data loss, it's more of a general category, and in many cases there isn't malicious intent. There may not be behavioral characteristics, but in the end, it is still impactful to the organization. So again, the information security protection program should try to prevent and detect both the malicious and the non-malicious data loss by the organization.
Thanks, Randy. So it really comes down to intention and the specific motivation of the insider, be it a malicious insider that is trying to exfiltrate IP or something sensitive important to the organization, or inadvertently emailing something outside the organization, right? They have a similar consequence, but the motivations are quite different.
I think there are a couple of other dimensions at play here too, Matt. You can think about exfiltration not necessarily as just the information leaving the organization's network at large, but you can think about exfiltration as being it moved from somewhere that we hoped or expected it to be to some other part of the network or onto some other device. While still an asset of the organization, we might not necessarily have wanted that information asset to appear on. So you can think about information systems that have maybe different levels of classification, something moving from one network to another, right? That would be something that we'd want to stop from happening, or at least know it happened. Didn't necessarily leave the organization, but it went from one part of the organization to another. We weren't necessarily hoping that that would be the case.
Thanks, Dan. So let's stay on the theme of moving information and moving networks. So imagine this scenario. I'm concerned about the insider. I'm concerned about the viability of my information security program. And my solution is I'm going to move it to the cloud. I'm going to give my problems to someone else, seemingly. Could you please, Randy and Dan, explain, in our research, what have we found regarding best practices in engaging in relationships with cloud service providers? And how do we see the rise of the cloud or migrations to the cloud modifying our assumptions and capabilities in the insider threat space?
Well, from a cloud service provider standpoint, there is a motivation to move to the cloud, whether you're in the federal government, whether you're in industry or academia. And really, there are benefits of moving to the cloud to rely upon another organization to provide that critical IT infrastructure or software, or other capabilities that you may not be able to do inherently better in your organization. So recognizing that that is something that is being adopted by many organizations, but also recognizing the potential risk posed by cloud service providers. When we go back to our definition of insider threats and insider specifically, now we are granting authorized access to a new category of employees that are managed by a different organization outside of ours that potentially now has authorized access to our critical information, our critical IT assets as well. So the work that we've done early on really looked at how do we provide resiliency into the operations of the IT cloud service providers, but also security is now being done as part of our research as well. So recognizing that those organizations can potentially have insider threats to their IT assets, which then are our IT assets, are a risk that we need to recognize as well. So some of the guidance that we give, again, going back to what Dan described as our common sense guide to the prevention and detection of insider threats, we do have a best practice specifically on cloud service providers and the risk they pose to our IT critical assets as well. We give recommendations around things such as service level agreements, detection and response responsibilities within those organizations as well. When response is needed, who's responsible for that? When notification is needed, who's responsible for that as well? Keeping in mind that we as an organization, when we transition to the cloud, it's our responsibility to define the data protection strategies that will be implemented within those organizations, because they're not going to know specifically what's normal activity or specifically what is authorized or unauthorized access. So we need to take an active role in defining the security requirements prior to migrating to those cloud service providers as well. And then finally, if an incident does occur, what are the responsibilities in terms of the financial remediations of those as well? So the strong suggestion is to go to our common sense guide, our best practice guide, look specifically at the best practice around cloud service providers, and also going to our website where we do have a couple of reports specifically on, prior to migrating to the cloud, what are the insider threat decisions you should make.
Thanks, Randy. So is it fair to say, Dan, that the insider threat question, when it comes to cloud, should be viewed as an extension of your existing requirements regarding the protection of your assets, right? To me, this is largely a supply chain risk management question, right? We all know that you can't fundamentally outsource risk, but there is a transference, both implicit and explicit, that goes on.
Absolutely, Matt. I mean, you've established a trust relationship with a third-party entity, and you've given them the same level of access to your critical assets as your full-time employees in many cases. So what we've always tried to do from a security perspective is raise the bar in terms of making sure that adequate security controls and coverage are provided for an individual that has the same level of access regardless of what name is on your badge or who signs your paychecks, right? Making sure that our full-time employees and the security controls and the auditability of their activity that we have is consistent with those that are vendors, third-party providers, our other trusted business partners. So absolutely, there's a risk transference issue here, and the goal for then the insider threat programs is to figure out how they can ensure the same degree of auditability they would have either themselves or indirectly through information sharing agreements they set up with the providers as they would if those activities were done in-house.
So the goal is to create an equivalency.
Absolutely, yeah. A consistent enforcement of your security controls across folks that have the same level of access.
Thank you. So a question about the insider that is not the intuitive source of this sort of risk. What I mean is, when I think about insider threat in our discussion this afternoon, I think about folks with privileged access, system administrators, database administrators, individuals with capabilities within applications, for instance, right? Can you speak to, Randy and Dan, how the end user, the standard end user in the organization, so those without elevated privileges, should be viewed in light of insider threat?
Yeah, that's a great differentiation. And what we try to do is when we build the models, when we try to build who's more likely to cause an IT sabotage type incident or theft of intellectual property or fraud, we try to break it down into the more common roles based upon the data that we've collected. So you're absolutely right. When we talk about system administrators, elevated privileges, escalated privileges, we found those individuals more likely to commit an IT sabotage incident as opposed to stealing the intellectual property or committing fraud against the organization. And really, because the knowledge of the value of the asset really is what raises the risk of an insider stealing the intellectual property. Many organizations, the IT operations, doesn't truly know the value of the infrastructure or the architecture or the data. So they don't know necessarily before leaving that they're going to take it with them to cause some type of value. So IT sabotage more likely to be an IT saboteur in the IT department. Now, if we move to theft of intellectual property, that tends to be the non-privileged users, the people that are developing the intellectual property, whether that be a research scientist or a developer or a scientist in an organization, or in some cases, the folks in business development that work with those assets on a day-to-day basis. They don't need the authorized elevated privileges. Excuse me, they do need the authorized privileges, but they don't need the elevated privileges to actually access the data or to see that data on a day-to-day basis. And when we move into the fraud category, those tend to be overwhelmingly the non-privileged users. But what I will say, it's someone with authorized access to a business process, to an application where they're working with customer data or employee data or the business operation data on a day-to-day basis. So they do have authorized access to that application or that system or the service, and they know the value of the asset, and because of their authorized access are able to change the data or to modify the data or to steal the data as well. So we tend to differentiate when we build those patterns of activity, the motivations, the individual who commit the harm. It tends to be theft of intellectual property. You don't need the escalated, elevated privileges. When you commit fraud, you don't need the escalated privileges to commit those types of harmful activities to the organizations.
Matt, I think we focus on kind of two key areas for those folks that don't necessarily have that special access. One is the potential for their authorized access to be a target from a malicious threat actor, right, from things like social engineering or phishing. So helping them understand what privileges they do have and responsibilities they have to help the organization protect that privileged access. As basic as providing that good security awareness training around phishing and social engineering attempts. I think the other dimension that is really important to think about here has to do with whether or not for each of those particular threat scenarios, right, what types of access are responsible for providing that business process within the organization, and also who within the organization has those adjacent capabilities. A lot of the times what we see are folks that are knowledgeable of how an existing business process works can have indirect access to those assets through folks they've established social networks within the organization who they can then coerce into giving up their access or acting as kind of an unwitting accomplice to their nefarious activity.
Thanks, Dan. I'd like to move to a new topic, which is it seems like we are awash in stories about artificial intelligence and machine learning changing just about every aspect of our lives. So I was hoping, Dan and Randy, and let's start with Dan, from the research perspective, what are we seeing as important or promising developments in machine learning or AI or software in general that might help either make insider threat detection more reliable, make it faster, make it cheaper?
Absolutely. So lots of organizations, as they mature their insider threat programs, spend a lot of time fusing together data from disparate sources and trying to do that activity that Randy had talked about earlier, which was anomaly detection. Once we see insider threat programs get advanced past strict policy enforcement, meaning every time we see this activity or condition occur within the organization, we know it's a violation of our policy and we know exactly how to act. The next degree of sophistication from a detection and prevention perspective is that anomaly detection, is finding that information we can't say 100% of the time is always associated with an active or about to be active insider incident, but is suspicious, requires a human in the loop. One of the ways that machine learning algorithms in particular can assist with this anomaly detection capability is by being able to detect patterns and establish patterns and deviations from those patterns across a much broader degree of dimensionality than humans can. If you and I can try to spot patterns across a couple of different dimensions in terms of the frequency of activity, the volume activity that an individual is performing. We can build out these vectors of features that are hundreds or tens or thousands of different concerning behaviors and activity and try to find those folks who for a single event or condition may not necessarily be anomalous, but across an aggregate of a bunch of different conditions, behaviors, or risk measurements would stick out as being something worth further and future investigation. So anomaly detection is really the area where we're seeing folks use machine learning to help them find those hidden patterns and trends in the data that they're bringing into the insider threat programs from disparate sources.
Thanks, Dan. So Randy, a question for you. If I'm an insider, especially a clever insider that's malicious, I'm going to try to cover my tracks. I'm trying to obscure what I'm doing. So whether we're using machine learning algorithms or human analysts to determine this, any advice regarding sort of the patterns or trends or the indicators you see that may lead an organization to those engaged in collusion, right? So at one point in my career, I was an IT auditor, and it was well understood that it's almost impossible to kind of audit for collusion, but rather you can investigate to determine collusion. Thoughts about these, and perhaps they're edge cases, but thoughts about how you identify instances of collusion among individuals in the organization engaged in some malicious insider activity?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that is a nuance of insider threats that makes it a bit more difficult to detect. Certainly, the general recommendations of implementing separation of duties within organizations are ways by which organizations are trying to prevent things like fraud from happening. Having dual control implemented in a business process is certainly something that can help reduce the risk of insider activity from occurring. When we start looking at the covering your tracks, as you started the question by saying, we did find a number of IT saboteurs specifically who were able to cover their tracks because they had authorized access to the system logs that were being generated that were potentially being used to detect that fraudulent activity or that malicious activity. So again, when we look at separation of duties and dual control, do you have the ability to implement those within the IT department? Will go a long way to protect the evidence of that type of activity that may be occurring within your organization. And when we did that incident analysis, as we go back to the case data that we have, again, we did find a number of insiders who over time tended to accumulate privileges. If you're in one job today, you get moved to a different job to get promoted, many organizations are able to grant additional access. And maybe you're supporting two roles at the same time where you need dual access to different sets of critical assets. But over time, organizations may get lax at truly enforcing the appropriate levels of privileges that needed for a particular job and activity as well. In many cases, people, by the accumulation of privileges, were allowed to bypass some of that detection capabilities that are instituted through that separation of duties. But you're absolutely right. When we get specifically into incidents that we've analyzed where there is collusion, it does become very difficult. The collusion, particularly on multiple levels, and particularly there's more collusion in the data we have when fraud is happening. A supervisor and an employee are involved in the fraudulent activity, it is more difficult to be able to detect that activity. Here's where we do need a very strong audit process in place where we actually audit transactions on a regular basis to detect some of those anomalies that may be inherent. Also, traditional controls like enforcing mandatory vacations might be helpful to detect those collusion rings that are in place as well. And if we just move slightly into collusion when it comes to theft of intellectual property, we decompose theft of IP into an individual who steals the IP alone. We have specific patterns of when someone does it alone, what those risk indicators are, but also when somebody tries to leave an organization and recruit others and bring data with them as well. We tend to describe those as an independent, entitled individual as opposed to a collusion ring of people stealing the IP as well. And things like the processes of non-disclosure agreements may help, or the non-compete agreements may help as well, or non-collusion may be identified through some type of business process as well. So again, it's very unique. It's very hard. You're right, it is an edge type case, but again, it is a risk that does need to be identified on the part of the organizations.
Thanks, Randy. Dan, a question for you. It seems like there's this growing tension between the ability to monitor and privacy expectations in organizations. Do you see in emerging privacy legislation or practices, anything that would impair or hinder our ability to effectively manage the insider threat?
Matt, I don't. I think insider threat programs face a challenge in terms of helping explain what it is that they're trying to do, how they're trying to do it, and how they are collecting and using the data they are trying to collect and use to make better risk-based decisions across a bunch of different areas within the organization. So I don't see some impending piece of legislation coming that'll fundamentally change the way that insider threat programs operate or the scope of what they can do. What I do see, though, is an increasing need for organizations to be thoughtful, well-documented, and process-driven in terms of the implementation and operations of the tools and data collection and analysis capabilities they're using to form the foundations of their insider threat programs. It's when we work with legal and privacy offices within organizations who are building out insider threat programs, we help them understand the role that the insider threat program is trying to play with regards to critical asset protection, and we work with them to work within the bounds of what is legal, what is authorized, what is compliant, what we are allowed to do with data, depending on where we are in terms of from a geographical perspective. For multinational organizations, that can change, right? So it really just has to do with kind of making sure the insider threat program has good situational awareness over kind of what those regulations are, and then helping make the case for the continued access and use of the information that we're trying to use to help reduce risk within the organization from insiders.
Thank you, Dan. So we have time for just one more question, and I'll ask it of both Dan and Randy. If you're viewing this today and you're supporting an insider threat program, or you're contemplating creating an insider threat program, I'd like to ask you first, Dan, and Randy, the same question. What is the first thing you should do in considering the construction of an insider threat program?
Take the lay of the land within your organization as to what pieces already exist that will form the foundations for your insider threat program. You are not developing this program in a vacuum. There are efforts for fraud detection and prevention, for data loss prevention, your security operations center, your chief risk officer, right? These are all capabilities and components that may already exist within your organization. When we're building out our insider threat programs, it's imperative that we define the scope of the program, what it is that we're trying to do, which of those assets that we're trying to protect, from what, and then do that with respect to what we already have in place from the organization's perspective that can address some aspects of that threat. So really, it's that situational awareness of finding the right people who can help us make the best and most well-informed scope decisions for the insider threat program, and also gain that inventory of current capability so that we don't duplicate efforts, and so that we can ensure effective enterprise-wide participation in the program, which is really one of the key aspects for success.
Thanks, Dan. Randy, the same question?
Absolutely. I agree 100% with what Dan said. I'd just like to maybe add to that to say that for each insider threat program, there does need to be a designated senior official, someone that owns the program, that has authority over the program, has the ability to require participation in the program. And once you have that key designated senior official, getting the right stakeholders involved. As Dan said, this is an enterprise-wide risk process. So you should have information technology having a seat at the table. You should also have human resources, as well as general counsel. The risk components of the organization need to be part of the program as well as physical security. If we have some type of other participation throughout behavioral scientists, they're very, very valuable as well. So getting the right stakeholders involved, as Dan said, to define the appropriate scope of the program to make sure we have asset protection as the key requirement of the program, but in the end, protecting the privacy and civil liberty. So absolutely agree with what Dan said. And if you are interested in building a program, I strongly suggest you refer back to our best practice guide. Best practice guide number 2 specifically gives you the guidance around building a formal insider threat program and lays out a roadmap for what that insider threat program is, along with what are the critical elements of what we think will make an effective insider threat program in your organization.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Randy. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so I want to thank you again for sharing your insights, your knowledge. Certainly there's a wealth of information, tools, and techniques available to the folks viewing this webcast. I'd also thank the folks that joined us today on the webcast. This is National Insider Threat Month, so it's front of mind, but we know that this is a pervasive and enduring challenge, and hope to see you back soon in another webcast.